Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're doing well, and welcome to another lure making tutorial by yours truly. So in this one we're going to be making a crankbait out of a very pretty looking species of fish that lives in the waters of North America, called Crossomus eos. And if you don't speak any Latin and have no idea what I'm talking about, it is a northern redbelly dace. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, and I'm going to be showing you how to make this pretty kick-ass looking crankbait. So now that I have the shape drawn onto this piece of wood, which by the way is basswood, I'm going to use an awl to kind of mark a hole for my pilot holes that I'm going to be drilling through the eye socket. Alright, next we're going to head out to the garage and I'm going to cut out the shape with my bandsaw. And I gotta say, basswood is really easy to work with. I've never worked with it before, and I think I will probably use it in the future. It is pretty sweet wood, although it does smell kind of funky. Remember the pilot hole that I just marked out with my awl just a few moments ago? Well, I'm just going to use my drill press now to drill a hole through the lure itself, and that will be my pilot hole for the eye socket. Next I will be drawing a center line around the lure, and this will help me in a couple of ways. First of all, it will be a visual representation for me to work out where the center of the lure is for my internal wire harness slot when I saw it. And also, when I do the upper profile, it will be there to help me out aligning the stencil a little bit better. Next I'm going to do the upper profile stencil, and I'm not really sure if I've actually ever included this into any of my other videos. Probably, but I just can't remember. I've made so many of them, it's kind of hard to keep track of these things. Anyways, what I usually just do is I mark out the thickness of the lure itself onto the paper, and then just doodle a pleasing shape. Once I have a shape that looks kind of good to me, I'm just gonna go ahead and fold a piece of paper and cut out the shape. And then when I open it, I have one identical stencil or template to use. Now that the template is done, I'm just going to tape it onto the lure, and I'm just going to use a permanent marker to trace out the outlines. Alrighty, so next I decided, you know what, it's the perfect time to do the lip slot, because this lure is still in a kind of a blocky state and it's easy to get a square and straight cut. And in order for me to achieve that, I decided to make a stencil, because I'm making a couple of these lures at a time. Usually I wouldn't probably bother with this because, you know, it's just one, but since I'm making a couple of them and I want to make them consistent, I decided to make a stencil to help me out with that. If any of you have ever worked with basswood before, you know that it's pretty light and very buoyant. So in order for me to make sure that it actually runs through and nicely, I need to add some ballast weight. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill a hole to accommodate that weight. And in the past I have had a horrible time with all kinds of tear outs and just horrible mess when I do it after I've shaped the lure. So I decided, you know what, I'm just gonna try out if this works better, and it actually did. So I think I'm gonna start doing this in the future. I think I mentioned in the beginning that this lure is gonna have a hidden lip slot, and if I didn't, well, this lure is gonna have a hidden lip slot. So in order for me to make that, I need to insert a few pieces of wood inside the lure, and I'm just going to cut appropriate size of wood here, and I'm just going to insert them into the lip slot and glue them into place. we're back to the garage, and now I'm going to saw the internal wire harness slot with my hacksaw. And I'm using a hacksaw because of the thickness of the blade is going to be more appropriate to a gauge of wire that I'm intending to use with this lure. And since I was in the garage, I decided, you know what, I'm just going to do the upper profile next with my disc sander. Alright, so now I'm going to start shaping the lure and taking off the excess. And in order for me to do that, I'm just going to use my hobby knife to do that. And I really like using hobby knives for this because they're usually extremely sharp. Sorry about the notification in the background. I should have turned off my phone. Anyways, nobody cares. Oh, where was I? Oh, hobby knives. So, these are really easy to get resharpened, and also if you happen to snap off a blade, no problem, they're not expensive at all, which is a really nice thing. Next I'm going to smooth out the knife marks on the lure, and I decided to go with kind of an oval shape on the lure, which should give us a nice belly roll later on. And also I've noticed the curious little thing here on YouTube when I watch lure making videos. I pretty much watch every one of you guys that make lure making videos. I just maybe don't comment on them that often. But especially when it comes to sanding, I see a lot of you guys going against the grain. And you always want to go with the grain, because that's more efficient way of getting rid of material. You know, just throwing that little tidbit out there. Alright, so next we're going to move on to bending the internal wire harness, and for this one I'm using 0.7mm stainless steel spring wire. And I like to use spring steel because obviously this one is stainless, which means rust resistance, so that's a big plus. And also because it's spring steel, and when you tune your baits, they kind of, if you use, let's say, galvanized wire, and you happen to hit your lure in a rock or something like that, it will bend and it will stay in that position. But with spring steel, it kind of like bends back into the position that you tuned your lure into. So it's a little bit more forgiving, I feel. When it comes to bending the internal wire harness, it's a pretty straightforward process, and you could break it down to 3 different parts: bend, fit, and repeat. I usually always start from the line tie first and then move myself backwards from there. And I oftentimes have some sort of mark on the belly of the lure where the belly hook hanger is going to be. And I almost never use any kind of jigs to bend my wires in, because the tolerances that I have are kind of loose, and oftentimes the length of the lure might be slightly different, or maybe the depth of the internal wire harness might be slightly different from lure to lure, so it doesn't really make any sense to me to make a jig for this. Now that I have all the wires bent to my liking, I can start gluing them in. But before that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut strips of this basswood again, and I'm going to fit them into the wire harness slots, so that later on, when the glue is drying, it's going to be much easier time for me to clean up. Alrighty, so now I'm gonna mix some 5-minute epoxy, and I'm gonna start gluing in the internal wire harnesses. So usually what I do is I lay a bead of epoxy on the very bottom of the lure first, then I fit the internal wire harness, and then I put more glue in there so that it's completely encased in epoxy and more difficult to rip out later on, hopefully. Now that the epoxy has cured, it's super easy to just use my hobby knife to clean up the wire slot. After epoxying the internal wire harness into the lure, I need to add the lead weight into the lure and of course fill that hole up as well. So for that I'm just using Bondo. At this point I decided it would be a good time to do the eye sockets, so I'm just going to drill those out. And the drill bit that I use is 1/4 of an inch or 6.35 millimeters. So I already knew before starting this project that I wanted to actually carve everything out, you know, scales, gill plates, mouth, everything. So that's what we're gonna do next, and I'm gonna start with the mouth. And usually the easiest way to go about this for me is that because this particular lure has very small details, I'm just going to basically hand draw a bunch of them, and in some I'm just going to use a stencil that I'm going to cut out of the sketch that I made earlier. Alright, now on to the carving, and if you've seen any of my other videos, you know exactly what I'm gonna do, so this is not gonna be any kind of a surprise for you. So, what I do is I follow along those guidelines that I drew onto the lure, and I'm just going to cut behind those lines and kind of lift off the excess wood. That way I get nice carved details, and they will be usually pretty crisp. And I like to use my 9mm hobby knife to do that. It's really good for small details such as these. Now that I'm done with carving all of the head details, I'm just going to finalize and smooth everything out with my lure Sander 3000. I mentioned earlier that I'm gonna have this fully carved, so next we're gonna move on to the scales. And what I usually do is I mark out where the lateral line is gonna be, and then I will go in certain type of increments where the scales will meet. And in this case they're gonna be 2mm apart. Then I will use this angling tool that I made specifically for drawing on scales. So first it kind of looks like herringbone, kind of a look, but then I will just flip it around, and then that will give me kind of a diamond pattern, which will help me draw on the scales a little bit easier. I decided that for my northern redbelly dace, I'm gonna try to imitate kind of a juvenile version of that fish. And usually juvenile species of fish, like any species really, don't really have a lot of scales. And especially underneath their lateral line, they usually don't have any scales visible. But what they do have is usually bones. So that's what I'm kind of trying to do next. This next step might or might not be necessary, because these scales are really small and I think I could probably get away with not drawing them on, but I decided to draw them on anyway. For carving out the scales themselves, I'm pretty much following the same exact formula that I did on the head details. So I'm just gonna go along all of those scales first, which there were many of. But thankfully this is not a pike or, let's say, maybe a trout, which there would be tens of thousands of these small little scales. So maybe in the future I will tackle one of those species again. Maybe a pike. Who knows? Actually, truth be told, I think I will be making a pike at some point, and I actually drew on one gigantic pike yesterday, which I think I will probably make, but more about that in a later video, I guess. Alright, now that I'm finally done carving all the scales, I'm just going to use my awl to poke a bunch of holes on the lateral line, which will then resemble the lateral line. Shocking, isn't it? Actually, funny thing, it just came to my mind that in a previous video I called this a pokey tool, and somebody was very quick to educate me on what this tool is actually called. So thank you very much for correcting me. Next, I'm going to put several coats of acrylic lacquer on the lure to make it ready for paint. Alright, let's start painting, and like always I need to prime the lure first, so I'm just going to use white. Although, this time around I'm going to do something a little different with the priming. For this paint job I decided to try something new and different, which is two-tone priming, and it's exactly what it sounds like. I'm just going to use two different colors of primer, black and white, to highlight different areas, which will then hopefully complement the colors that I will be choosing to paint on the rest of the lure. Alright, let's start adding some color. And first, what I'm gonna start doing is I'm gonna start adding some of the metallic colors first, because those will be kind of more prominent in a way, but still kind of shaded, if that makes any sense. Don't worry, it will make sense later. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to spray this Quicksilver from Createx. It is the Wicked Colors line. So continue with the metallic colors that I want to add on this lure. I'm gonna be using this gold chrome from the same Wicked Colors line from Createx. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a little bit of this gold into the cheeks and just above the lateral line. Let's keep up with the metallic theme here. And next I'm gonna add this iridescent lemon yellow from Mission Models. And initially I thought that this would be a good match here, but I ended up actually going over with this with some other paint, because I felt like this is a little bit too citrusy looking, if you know what I mean. And I wanted to have kind of a more muted tone. So in order to mute that yellow a little bit further, I decided to use medium yellow from Vallejo, and that was exactly what this paint job needed. I think this ended up looking way better than it did before. So on the flank of a red belly dace, there's usually a hint of red or orange, I guess hence the name red belly dace. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do next. And I kind of wanted to overdo it a little bit to make this kind of pop a little bit more, I guess. And yeah, that's exactly what I ended up doing. And moving up on the flank, I'm gonna add some Russian green on the back of this bait. And depending on what sort of photos you can find from the internet, some of these red belly dace have kind of a, well, greenish look, or some of them have more brownish. So I decided to just go with the green, because I think it has a nice contrast between the red and the yellow and the other metallic colors. Next, we're going to do a little trick that I like to do on lures that have some sort of carved details on them, and that is black wash. And what it does, it basically highlights those areas that you apply the black wash in. So what I like to use is my airbrush, which has heavily diluted paint, usually black, and I just brush it onto the areas that I want it to be highlighted. You could probably just use maybe a Q-tip, for example, or a paintbrush. You could either probably just dip the whole lure into black wash if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend that. Next, we're gonna move on to the fins, and I wanted to mask those with just masking tape. Usually I would just make a stencil that is covered with plastic packing tape, but you know, This is just one, so I decided, you know what, I'm just going to use tape and it will work just as fine. And actually, this is a very good way of making sure that paint doesn't go into the areas that you don't want it to go. The fins themselves are pretty easy to paint. There's actually not too many colors on them, so I'm just going to use black to make the fin rays. Another really prominent feature of the northern redbelly dace is this kind of a stripe that goes along its flank. And if you look at photos of them, that line is usually never straight. So I'm just trying to shake my airbrush while I do the line to kind of imitate that waviness of the line. When I was at this point of the paint job, I could have just raised my hands in the air and be like, done. But I felt like something was missing, so I decided to add a little bit of this pearlescent white into the belly. After adding that pearlescent white, I still felt like there was something missing on the paint job, so I decided to add some color shift paint to it in the violet and blue color, which I think was exactly what I needed. Now that the paint job is done, I'm just gonna mix up some 5-minute epoxy and glue in the eyes. Once the epoxy on the eyes had cured enough, I headed to the garage again and sprayed several layers of this Varathane semi-gloss acrylic varnish onto the lures. Normally I would have used epoxy, but you know, I just wanted to try the different things out and see how well this thing actually would hold up to abuse. While the clear coat was drying in the garage, I headed back inside to work on my lip. And I'm gonna do exactly the same thing I did with the upper profile template, where I just fold a piece of paper in half, doodle a shape that looks pleasing to my eye, and just cut it out with scissors. And that will be my template. The material that I chose to use on this lip is Lexan polycarbonate sheet, which is 1.7 millimeters thick. I figured the fastest way of cutting out the lip would be to use my bandsaw, and that is exactly what I did. But I gotta say, it wasn't fun being in the fumes of that clear coat. I definitely lost a couple of brain cells, I'm pretty sure of that. Once back inside, I started to work on the lip, and I figured the fastest way of going about it would be just to use my hobby knife to get rid of all of the scuff marks first, and then go over it with some sanding paper. Before I glued in the lip, I scuffed up the surface a little bit and roughed it up with some 80 grit sandpaper to make sure that the glue has something to grab onto. So again, I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy and glued in the lip. So here we have the final product in all of its glory. And I gotta say, this thing turned out pretty freaking sick. I really like the contrast of different colors, and also the carved details look pretty cool. I mean, I've done a whole bunch of carved lures before, but it's always cool to see something that you made kind of come alive. And like always, a solo baits video wouldn't be completed without the traditional swim test video. And as you can see, this thing has a really awesome looking action. I'm really happy with this, and I think I will probably mold this or make a version out of this and mold it with better details, and maybe I'll sell them. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just use them for myself. I don't know. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like the video if you did. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and also you can support me on Patreon nowadays if you want. But that's optional. And also I would like to acknowledge the fact that I hit 50,000 subscribers. I think I hit that during my last build video. So thank you very much for subscribing to my channel, and hopefully in the next 10 years we're gonna hit 100,000 or something. I don't know. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.